All right, everyone. So I'm very pleased to introduce our next session. We have Marianne Crowe, who's the Vice President of Secure Payments Innovation and Research for the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. And Marianne has been doing work for quite a while looking at remote authentication fraud, where it is and where it's going. And we're really happy to welcome her to present on what the latest is for state and future of remote authentication fraud. So thank you, Marianne.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me in this session today. I have to say, though, I listened to sessions this morning and then Megan's, and it was a great setup. I don't know if it was intentional to talk about what's going on in authentication and what some of the consumer issues as we move into what I want to talk about this afternoon, which is similar but from a different angle. So I'm not a technologist. I'm not a security expert. I'm more of a payments geek, and I've been in payments a long time. But I have been looking at payments related to security. In terms of the work we do in our small group at the Fed, we do research and outreach with industry people, so banks and credit unions and card networks, merchants and others, to try to understand what's going on with them. And we've been looking at it related to security and fraud for the past few years. So that's the angle that I have for this presentation. So we're not talking about vendor solutions, but we want to, so as I go through this, think about sort of where I want to come out at the end is what can we do to make this better? How can we help the industry through collaboration, which was also mentioned a lot this morning, to work together to try to take what the vendors and the solution providers have and how we're trying, and FIDO as well, to try to move in the right direction for better authentication. But how do we get there? It's not a simple thing to do, and that's kind of what I want to sort of highlight here. So we know that the US payment system has been facing a lot of different issues around more and more threats and technology issues related to authentication fraud, and certainly in the digital payment space. Multi-factor authentication comes up all the time. It came up a lot this morning. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in this session. It's not perfect. It's not the be-all, end-all, but one of the things that we're thinking is you have to do something now until we get to the point where we can move to a true passwordless authentication world. In the United States, it is our focus in particular. So we can't just ignore that. We still have to try to improve it if we can. So I want to talk about that, and then at the end I do want to talk about a couple of potential opportunities for the industry to collaboratively work together and see what you think about those. Do they make sense or not? All right, so let's see if this is right. Okay. So first of all, what do I mean by remote authentication and remote authentication fraud? Basically, I'm talking about in the digital space, so I'm not talking about point of sale, but primarily the digital space in the financial services as well as in remote e-commerce, digital payments, and things like that. So we need authentication to corroborate and identify a claimed identity. We need to make sure that the person engaged isn't a bot, it's a real person. And we also, in the background, through other methods, are looking at information to try to continue to assess the authentication and make sure it's not fraud. So there's a lot of stuff going on as part of remote authentication. But the key in the remote space is the real person isn't there. So you can't have a face-to-face to validate, yes, you are you, what I show you is what I have. You're going based on other information to validate that person. And one of the key things in that case in particular that goes along with multi-factor and other things is that the more you can authenticate from the point of enrollment through the process, through the purchase to the end, by using different tools, the chances are you're going to have a better shot at saying this is a real person, it's not a fraudster, it's a legitimate transaction. So why do we think remote authentication needs to improve? Well, why are we all here today and in this conference and other things that are going on in the industry? We know that the volume of remote authentication accounts has increased over the past several years, and particularly in the last couple of years with COVID, more and more people who never made perhaps digital payments or financial services have done so. Those of us who did it already did it even more. But the problem partly is the new people maybe are less concerned about, are less cognizant of the issues and the fraud and the risks, and so they might be the ones that are contributing even more to the fraud in terms of remote authentication and needing to address it. So it's driving up new account fraud, it's driving up account takeover frauds. Those numbers haven't really gone down in the industry based on just general statistics and things that we've seen. A lot more channels, so they're using their mobile phone, again, sometimes for the first time or just not as familiar with it. They're going on their laptop. We've got lots of different channels, and we've got different ways to access it. And then this one comes up all the time, consumer fatigue. We all have it. We know that we use a lot of passwords because we have to right now. A lot of people, as we've seen, they copy their passwords. They use the same ones. Maybe they add a number or two. I'm as guilty as other people are. And I mean, I have them, I shouldn't even say this, but I write them down on a little piece of paper somewhere and, you know, pull it out when I need to. And it's a pain in the neck because people might have 30 or 40 or more different places you have to use passwords today where you don't have biometrics available. And that's, you know, something that we just have to all deal with. And here's the example of that. When I put this together, this isn't even everything, but just look at all these different places where we need to authenticate. Clearly in the banking world, yes, online banking, username and password, for the most part. Some banks have started to use one-time passcodes as well, SMS codes. I have two particular banks that I do most of my business with. One's a really big bank. Optionally, they asked, do you want to use, add a one-time code when you're logging in? So I said yes, and so I still put my username and password in and then that. The other bank is just username and password. So it's inconsistent. Online banking, wallets, we can use our biometrics there instead of a password. But then you've got lots of e-commerce merchants, payment service providers, P2P vendors and applications, airlines and hotels, they do things differently. Nothing's consistent, and yet most of them, the underlying use is username and password. So, and even things that are free, like subscriptions to financial magazines or other things, you have to put a username and password in. Well, if you're putting one in there that's the same as what you're using in your online banking system, and the fraudsters can get access to that information, you've kind of defeated the purpose of it. So we really have to focus on these. And because of the large number of the sites and all of that, it's going to be easier for the fraudsters to access and test out the different passwords and then use them to attack other sites as well. So with that, we know that authentication practices don't catch all the fraud. We've got practices that vary across the industry, as I said, not only just within segments. Within the banking industry, it's a little different. Then you go to the merchants, you go to the processors or the third-party mobile wallets and the applications. Nobody's doing things quite the same way, so of course the consumers are confused. They're easier to get, they're not, passwords are phishable, we know that, they're gonna make sure they can get them. There's lots of PII information out there as well, so that anybody with all the different media sites, social sites, there's lots of information that they can figure out and put it all together. So because of all of this, the businesses, the banks, the merchants, they do things differently, and that's normal, that's okay if they're still doing it the right way. So it's not that we're saying there's a one-size-fits-all to do multi-factor authentication or anything like that, even in the passwordless space. They're going to have their own strategies. They have their own levels of risk appetite. They have different kinds of customers, different levels of dollar value or financial value. So you have to accept that those are all different, but there's still got to be a way to somehow level the playing field and have them work together to come up with solutions, and I mean business solutions versus vendor solutions that will help make this work. Now, in the current environment, MFA still exists, and it goes along hand in hand with multi-layered authentication. I know it's been referenced before that there's been guidance. There's more attention to it now in the past couple of years, I think. Certainly FFIEC, as I noted here, came out with guidance, and it's guidance. It's not a regulation, but it's guidance, although banks are expected to adhere to it for their own customers around using multi-layered authentication as well as multi-factor authentication. So basically, if one of the multiple opportunities to authenticate fail, the others are supposed to be able to catch it or are prevented by using those instead. And again, here, these things vary as well. But it's just intending to put multiple layers in to try to at least make it harder for the fraudster to get through. They might have your username or password. If they can't get your OTP code or something else, then you can block them. This is basic stuff. I'm not saying this is the way we should be doing it. It's the way it is today, and in the interim, what we have to try to do until we can get to something that's more secure. So then we get to multi-factor here. So this is just showing you all the different types of factors that apply in the multi-factor authentication world, and none of them are new to you, I know. We just kind of group them into the something you know. We know that those are not secure, are not the best passwords and best ways of doing it. This morning we heard about the issues around push notification as well. We go over and over again with SMS and one-time passcodes. So even though they're a little bit stronger than just username and password or knowledge-based information, they still have flaws and weaknesses. Then you get into the something you have and ultimately something you are. And that's where we want to go eventually. And so the question is, how do we get there? I guess my point is that what we're trying to say is there's lots of this stuff going on now. We're not where we want to be, and we don't know how long it's going to take to get there. We have to still improve the multi-factor authentication process today, and we've got to try to increase implementation of it and adoption, even in industries and businesses that aren't required to do it. So the banks have to do something. Merchants, other businesses, processors, they have more leeway, and it's different across the board. And as long as it's inconsistent and not communicated the same way to customers, we're still going to have problems and inconsistencies because it's not mandated. If it's optional, we want the customers to think it's necessary to use it. How do we get there? And that's why I said sort of think about that as we look at where we want to go down the road. Now, in addition to just multi-factor authentication, so at least we do have other checks and balances in the system. We've got behavioral approaches, so different authentication tools like behavioral analytics and behavioral biometrics. Some might call those the fourth factor. It's something that you do. The larger, more sophisticated organizations, banks and others, have the means and the resources to implement these kinds of tools. The third-party payment processors probably do too, so that the smaller, and I don't mean just smaller banks, but smaller e-commerce merchants and others might be able to leverage those tools as well if they have the money and the resources and the knowledge to be able to do it. So they're out there, but again, they're not consistently used. Maybe if they were, the fraud situation would be a little bit better. How do we fix that, or how do we address that? And then, in addition to that, for the same reasons, we have more passive but strong authentication approaches that work in the background. They're passive, they're typically real time, so we all know, rules-based authentication, risk-based authentication. So in the background, data can be collected and analyzed using artificial intelligence and machine learning, taking a look at all this stuff while the transaction's still going on. Even if the authentication up front is weak or suspicious, this analysis can be done, and if it's necessary, they can do step-up authentication and try to stop it. Passwordless authentication is what we're going to talk about anyway, but that's certainly a background, less invasive type of authentication to the customer or the consumer than some of the multi-factor authentication methods are. And then continuous authentication, where it's similar. It's going on during the process of the transaction in the background. Again, it's going to use data, and if there's an issue, it can highlight it, require step-up authentication in terms of validating. So all of this stuff happens in the background, but it doesn't happen for everybody. It doesn't happen, not all banks, not all merchants, e-commerce merchants or others, and others in the industry use these kinds of tools, especially if they're smaller, or they just may not be able to afford them, or they may not use them to the level that they could potentially use them because maybe they don't know about them, or maybe they don't understand how they work and what the value is, how it can help reduce fraud further. How do we get that to happen? So I think in general, my point is that industry trends suggest the need for stronger fraud mitigation. A couple of months ago, we talked to about 15 or 20 different industry experts around fraud and MFA and where we could go with this. And so it was some banks, some larger banks, smaller banks, some of the merchants, e-merchants, or at least merchants that had online business, some of the card networks, and the payment processors, so about 15 or 20. And generally speaking, you know, they all agree there's no one-size solution that fits all. The biggest concern was that in the US, because other countries do things differently, they're smaller, they're more focused. The US, we're big, we have 50 states, 50 types of, you know, governments and things that have to work together on all of this stuff, and lots of different companies. So we can't sort of model what's going on in other countries because we're different. But basically, what we don't have is a cohesive strategy to address remote payment authentication in this country. We have lots of good ideas, lots of tools, lots of different vendors are developing things. We have FIDO, but it's not cohesive. And how do we make that happen, or can we make that happen? From some of the feedback from the group, just a couple of things. They all agreed that there's no one-size solution for MFA to do it. You still have to do it based on what your own business needs are, but it could be improved. And generally, they're supportive of passwordless authentication, the longer term. One of the things that I thought was interesting was that when it came to education, particularly of consumers, the jury was still kind of out on whether or not that even adds any value. There were some who said, we can put things up on the site, we can explain it, they don't even look at it if they try to tell them why it's important to do this, or maybe think about one-time passcodes or some other kinds of controls. Some customers will do it, others totally ignore it. And so in this particular case, the person thought it was kind of a waste of time. So, you know, how do we balance that? How do we do better education? And maybe it's also starting with how do we educate the people in the businesses and the banks first, so that when they don't just throw something out on the website. And now I'll go back to the example of where the bank, my primary bank, offers one-time passcode, and I use it. But I don't ever see them advertising or explaining it to other, you know, when I go on their website to see if they're pushing it or they're continuing to try to explain, you should do this over and over. So unless you go looking for it or you're familiar with it when you first see it, nobody's going to do it, especially because it is somewhat friction. I have to still stop. I have to make sure I have my phone in my hand when I log on, and I put the code in. And it takes 5 seconds, but some people are still going to find that unnecessary, or they can't be bothered because they don't understand the value of adding some of these layers and, you know, eventually getting to a point where it's even better. So another area that the feedback came from was we need more data. Now, this is consistent across the board that the more data around fraud you can share, not only within your organization, what they're saying is we want to share this fraud data across organizations and across groups. There are organizations and consortiums in the US that do that today, and some, you know, the clearinghouse has data that they share. Other groups do. Is there a way to do that without impacting privacy, things like that? That's another area that this group gave feedback on. And one particular area was around mobile carriers. So the mobile network operators or the mobile carriers, they have all the data around the use of the device. Where is the device? Is the person dialing the device with the number of the same person who you sent the code to? And there's lots of other data around the mobile device. The MNOs are even more restricted in terms of what they can share, or that the fact that they can't share with other, I guess, businesses. So is that something that's a barrier that can be discussed and perhaps look at ways to figure it out? And again, all of this leads up to how do we get to passwordless. But what I'm suggesting is it's a step-by-step process, but we want to speed up that process. So where do we go from here? If we agreed that we don't have a cohesive strategy, can we build one? And can we get industry folks like yourselves and others to collaborate in, I don't like to say work groups, but certainly in group dialogue and discussion, not to develop or design something, but to come up with ideas and ways to better inform the industry. So we came up with 2 ideas, and I mean, they've already kind of mentioned them, so it's not a surprise. But if I can't change the slide, I can't show you. Okay. The first one, still saying enhance the multi-factor authentication process to increase adoption of effective MFA techniques. Now, it means, first of all, increased implementation by the businesses and banks and others who aren't using it or aren't using it as effectively as they could. And then from that, also then work on, even if I offer it, how do I get the consumers to actually accept it and start using MFA in areas where it's not required. So potentially, that would be one project. We get a group together, have dialogue, discussion on it, and see what we come up with, maybe develop best practices, toolkits. This is not something that's regulatory, mandated, or anything like that. It's just an industry group. We might, be the ones who convene the group or help organize it, but basically work together and leverage all the expertise in the group and in the room around how you might do this, and perhaps come to some general agreement on trying these things out and how we then communicate and roll stuff like that out to others in the industry who may not understand this as well and may need more help with it. So that's one. And basically, just from the rationale perspective here, we still think that not implementing MFA at all, even if it's not where we want it to be and it could be better, is worse than trying to do something and improving it in the interim while we figure out how to get to the next phase, which would be our second recommendation, which would be how do we get to passwordless authentication. So here, obviously this is more complicated just listening to all the stuff that's been talked about today. It's harder to get people's arms around it. I'm not talking about the enterprise. I'm specifically talking about in the payments industry, banking, financial services, merchants, and others. So you're dealing with the customers and consumers. It's not like you can work, if I work in a company and they implement FIDO, you have to use it. It doesn't work that way in the industry. So how do we figure that out? What can we do there? So what we're proposing here is that we initially do a feasibility study. From different things we've heard about FIDO and passwordless authentication, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. I don't think we want to wait that long, but how do we, if we don't want to wait that long, is there anything we can do to help it along in parallel to what's being done in terms of the development and what this organization is doing? And so what we're saying is perhaps do a feasibility study with experts to take a look at what it would take, how it would impact different industry groups, what are some of the ways we could make that happen, and put that out first, and then go from there as a next step to see if we could more focused get the industry behind pushing towards a passwordless authentication direction in fewer years than what you hear about today and when you read about this stuff. And if anything, it would at least help educate and inform the industry around what's really going on, perhaps reaching areas that aren't being communicated to today. So those are what we're proposing. This is what we've been thinking about, and we'd like to continue these discussions, perhaps having an initial meeting maybe in December or early January just to talk more about it. Certainly interested in your thoughts on this. Does this make sense? Do you think we're crazy trying to worry about it? Do we need to worry about it? Are you interested in being involved? You can either let me know today, or you can email me or whatever, but I'm definitely looking for input from industry experts to see whether or not this makes sense and whether either of these would help move the industry along in terms of reducing remote authentication fraud. So with that, I will stop there and see if there are any questions, if we have a few minutes.
Thank you, Marianne. Do we have any questions in the room for Marianne? Well, I would just say from a FIDO Alliance perspective, if we can, I think there's a difference between educating the banks about how great this is and showing them what it actually takes to do it. We're fully supportive of that. So I think that would be, I think these are great recommendations. So we should definitely talk more and definitely reach out to Marianne if any of this sounded, if you'd like to get involved or be supportive of these efforts, because I think they are very critical for us to reach the financial services industry in the United States. So I really appreciate your talk.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think your point is education. It's not education. It's how do we provide the tools that they need and the connections to make it happen. But that's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.